Welcome to the church family that is lifting lives through living love, inspiring hope, filling with faith, and transforming our world. These recorded messages are made available so that you might have additional opportunities to stay connected with us and that you might learn and grow in your faith. God bless you as you hear the word today. And now, the message.
Good morning, church. Today's reading is going to be from Numbers chapter 11. The rabble with them began to crave other food. And again the Israelites started wailing and said, "If only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost. Also the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. But now we have lost our appetite. We never see anything but this manna." Moses heard the people of every family wailing at the entrance to their tents. The Lord became exceedingly angry, and Moses was troubled. He asked the Lord, "Why have you brought this trouble on your servant? What have I done to displease you that you put the burden of all these people on me? Did I conceive all these people? Did I give them birth? Why do you tell me to carry them in my arms as a nurse carries an infant, to the land you promised on oath to their ancestors? Where can I get meat for all these people? They keep wailing to me, 'Give us meat to eat.' If I cannot carry all these people by myself, the burden is too heavy for me. If this is how you are going to treat me, please go ahead and kill me, if I have found favor in your eyes, and do not let me face my own ruin." May the Lord bless the hearing and reading of his word.
This is our second week that we're talking about Moses. If you were with us last week, we talked about his call to ministry, the burning bush. And then this week we kind of look at the practice, like how that ministry played out, the good, the bad, and the ugly. This is part of a larger series we're doing on spiritual practices. And allow me to take a quick recap of everything we've talked about up to this point. A couple weeks ago, Kim and I talked about the practice of stillness, kind of clearing away the clutter and the noise, the chaos of our lives, being still. And then Seth followed up by preaching about frugality, which is about simplifying, our needs and our wants so that we can receive and celebrate and share the gifts that God gives us. And the last week I talked about attentiveness. After you clear the chaos and the clutter, all the noise, and after you simplify your wants, then you attend to the voice of God calling in our places of wilderness. And then this week we get to the practice of leadership, which kind of feels like which one of these is not like the other. Like all the others feel spiritual, but leadership, spiritual? That's not what leadership is. Ruth Haley Barton, in her marvelous book, Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership, she often notes that the places in which many of us are trying to provide leadership, they're places where everyone's crashing through the woods, she says, harried and breathless, staying on the surface of intellect and ego, while all things soulful flee deeper into the woods. There were real tension between what the human soul needs in order to be well and what life and leadership encourages and often requires. You ever felt that tension between what your own soul needs and what the organization, all those people who are looking up to you, what leadership requires? It's a real tension. She goes on to kind of elaborate on this tension. She says there's a tension between being and doing, between community and cause, between truth-telling or just putting the right spin on things. There's tension between the time it takes to love people and the need for expediency, tension between the need for measurable goals and the difficulty of measuring that which is ultimately immeasurable by anyone but God himself. And then there's the challenge of knowing how to speak of these things in fruitful ways, and the very inside places of power without becoming polarized in our relationships with one another. There is a tension between our souls and our leadership. Even Jesus pointed to this tension, didn't he? He warned us about the dangers of climbing the ladder. He says, "What good does it do a man to gain the whole world, but to lose his soul?" It's all too easy to sacrifice our souls on the altar of leadership on the altar of achievement and success and respect and influence. But what if there is a different way? What if there's a way to practice soulful leadership? What if leadership can be the context in which we experience God in a way that we never could in any other place? That's what I want to talk about this morning. Leadership as a spiritual practice. So if we do that, let's just start by acknowledging that leadership is a call. Leadership is a call. God calls to Moses and calls him specifically to a life of leadership. Now, Moses doesn't want to answer the call. If you remember the story we talked about last week, he's full of excuses. Well, I can't do that. I stutter. I don't speak very clearly. What about my brother? Why don't you call him instead? Like he consistently kind of puts up his hands like, not me, not me, not me. And God keeps saying, yes, you, yes, you, yes, you. I want you to be the leader of my people. And I just want you to reflect on this. If God calls Moses to leadership, he's not calling Moses to something that's going to crush his soul. Truth is God continues, just as he called forth Moses, he continues to call forth leaders in our world. And I would contend that every single one of us is called to be a leader. Regardless of what stage of life we may be in, regardless of where we may be in the org chart, we are called to be a leader among our coworkers, in our families, in our neighborhoods, among our peers, in all times and all places. We are called to be leaders. Reggie Joyner says the essence of spiritual leadership is to lead a life worth imitating. And friends, as we imitate the life of Christ, we automatically become leaders that God uses to make a difference in the world around us. We're called to be leaders. And if we are called to leadership, then that also implies that if God calls, it is a gift that he gives. Whenever God calls anyone in Scripture, it's always a gift. And the gift of leadership is this, that leaders can make things happen, right? They can bring about change. They can galvanize a movement among their people, or they can protect the vulnerable from harm. Leadership, where there is good leadership in the world, individuals and communities thrive. Can you think of a good leader that you've known? Someone, whether it's a family member or a boss you work for, someone who exercised great leadership and you had a front row seat to experience it. It's a gift whenever you experience good leadership. Liz Wiseman, a number of years ago, wrote a great book called Multipliers. And she says, this is what a good leader does. They multiply the gifts and talents and experiences of everyone who works for them. And she bases this off of, tons of interviews she does. And she eventually kind of divided this line between multipliers and diminishers. And she said, people who work from multipliers, they report that in the time they worked underneath the multiplying leader, that not just, their impact, but their knowledge, their gifts, their confidence, it all grew and abounded. But the flip side is that Liz kind of says, there's also people who work under diminishers. And when they work underneath a diminisher, doesn't matter how hard how much time and effort you put in. People who work under diminishers, they feel like their impact, their confidence, their skills, it all kind of gets pushed down. If you've ever worked underneath a bad leader, a leader who is belligerent or controlling or cowardly, you know that experience too. But this is not what God intends. When God calls leaders, he calls us forth for good purposes. Because where there is good leadership, people and communities thrive and abound. We multiply. That's what God intends. But with the gift comes a burden. If call is a gift, call is also a burden. And this is the part of Moses' story that we confront today, that here he is in the thick of leadership, and everything he experiences is burden, burden, burden. Why have you called me to these people? Why have you told me to carry them all the way to the promised land? Kill me now. I would rather die here than face my own failures, trying and struggling to lead this stiff-necked people. Leadership is a burden. There's the burden of decision making. when you don't have all the information you need, right? There's the burden of isolation because you're carrying a load that no one else around you is carrying and you don't even know how to share it. There's the burden of having to have thick skin because of the slings and arrows of all those around. And that's in the best of times. Leadership can be a burden. And we are not living in the best of times now, are we? In the last 2 years especially, the burdens of leadership have exponentially increased. John Maxwell says leadership involves the heavy burden of responsibility, and the fear of getting it wrong can paralyze the leader. I think so many leaders, I felt it myself, that paralyzing fear of getting it wrong. It's been hard the last few years. Just think about it. The increasing polarization of our world, that we argue just about anything you do, any decision that gets made, the painful reckoning with our racial injustice and how to guide difficult conversations around that, the fear and anxiety around COVID, the debates around vaccines and masks, and just the angst that we all feel. Like anyone who has been engaged in leadership in the public arena has felt this burden. My neighbor across the street is the president of our HOA, and I say to him all the time, were you not getting beat up enough at work enough that you wanted to come home and bring it here? Because it's just, if you're a leader, you're getting beat up in some shape, form, or fashion. It's just what happens in our world today. A couple years ago, last fall, I attended a conference, and Adam Hamilton was speaking. If you're not sure who Adam Hamilton is, he's the pastor of the largest Methodist church in America, but his name can be very polarizing in the denominational debate and split that we're experiencing now. But in this context, I was listening to Adam speak, and he said he just kind of went back through the events of the last 2 years. And then he paused and he made this admission. He said, in my career of ministry, which is 4 decades long at this point, he says, in my career of ministry, I've considered retirement 3 times seriously. And 2 of those times have come in the last 18 months. As I sat and I listened to that, I felt, strangely enough, validated, comforted as a pastor, like, I'm not alone. I'm not alone. And it's not just Adam Hamilton, he's more contemporary to me, but here we got Moses saying, God, I'll do anything. Just let me lay down this burden of leadership. A couple weeks ago, it was Elijah in a cave crying out against the people that God called him to lead. You can go through the scriptures, Isaiah, Jeremiah, David, even Jesus, the night before he was betrayed, prayed, Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. It's a burden. And if that resonates at all with where you are right now with your own leadership, let me offer one more word. Leadership also can be a crucible. A crucible. That's the subtitle of Ruth Haley Barton's book. It's finding God in the crucible of ministry, she says. So she defines crucible in this way, that a crucible is a place or a set of circumstances where people or things are subjected to forces that test them and often make them change. Leadership, she says, is a crucible. It's a place where we are tested, but also a place where we can grow and change. Leadership is exhausting. It'll test, stretch, challenge you in every possible way. It will bring you to your limits of knowledge, your limits of patience, your limits of strength and energy. It'll bring you to your limits, but in doing so, leadership forces us back into a conversation with God, just like it did Moses. I don't know how to do this, God. I don't know what you want from me. I don't know how to be the leader I want to be. And in those conversations, that's the spiritual practice of leadership. That's where we grow and change, in the crucible. Think about Moses, for instance. What if he had just said when he received the call, what if God had accepted his excuses and said, sure, I'll send your brother Aaron, and said, you just go back and watch your father-in-law's sheep. Think about everything that Moses would have missed out on. He would have missed out on seeing God show up in big, amazing, transformative ways. He would have missed out on understanding God's provision. Manna in the desert, water, quail. Whenever he cried out to God, God provided for him. He would have missed out on all those intimate conversations. Receiving the law at the top of Mount Horeb. Or that moment, that time where he said, I can't go any further unless I see you, God. And he got to see the glory of God passing by in a way that no one else ever before did. But most importantly, if Moses had said no, he would have missed the opportunity to go back and redeem his own broken past. Remember when God called Moses, where was he? He was on the run. He was hiding out, hiding from the memories of seeing his people oppressed, hiding from the memory of how he himself got so angry at that he killed an Egyptian and ran for his life. And in leadership, God calls Moses to go back and to see that God can bring something redemptive out of the most broken places of our lives. Ruth Haley Barton puts it this way. She says, the first leg of Moses' journey as a leader was not to lead anyone else anywhere. It was to allow himself to be led into freedom from his own bondage. That's what leadership does. It calls us to face our own brokenness, our own bondage, and to allow God to lead us out of there. So yes, leadership is a gift and a burden. It's a call and a crucible. It is the place in which God forms us. One more quote from Ruth Haley Barton. If you are still at this point thinking that where you lead and the care of your own soul are two separate things, she says, leadership is an opportunity to forge a connection between our own souls and our leadership rather than experiencing them as separate arenas in our lives. Spiritual formation is the process by which Christ is formed in us for the glory of God, for the abundance of our own lives, and for the sake of others. And that's what the spiritual practice of leadership does. It forms Christ in us. Can we get that quote up on the screen with Ruth Haley Barton? There it is. No, not that one. Oh, maybe we don't have it. Sorry. I would have loved you guys to see that quote. She goes on and she says, in the process of transformation, here's what the Spirit of God does. He moves us from behaviors motivated by fear and self-protection to trust and abandonment to God. From selfishness and self-absorption to freely offering the gift of authentic self. From the ego's desperate attempts to control the outcomes of our lives to an ability to give ourselves over to the will of God, which is often the foolishness of this world. She closes by saying that is what those around us most need. We all need leaders who are allowing themselves to be set free by God. At this point, I'm going to invite forward a friend of mine to reflect a little bit further on the practice of leadership. This is my friend Shannon Ross. Shannon and I were seminary roommates at Duke Divinity School. And after that, Shannon went on to get his PhD at Garrett Theological Seminary and then worked for a while as youth pastor in Naperville at Knox Presbyterian, and then went from there to Princeton Theological Seminary. And what year was it when you got recruited back to Indy?
2016.
2016, the Lilly Endowment recruited Shannon, invited him to come and be part of their staff. And for me, it was a real gift that, this friend and that we hadn't lived together since seminary, that we had the opportunity to live in the same city and our families got to be friends. So Shannon, why don't you say a few words about yourself and your family especially?
My family's here, and we moved to Indianapolis in 2016. My wife and I are originally from Oregon. We've lived in Washington, North Carolina, Chicago, New Jersey, and now here. So we say sometimes, well, if we could somehow manage to get the southwestern United States in, we feel like we would have gotten all four corners. Yeah, we have 3 children, Noah, Zachary, and Savannah, and have loved being here. So.
Yeah, and let everyone know what your wife's name is, because I always find it.
Oh yes, so my family's back here. My wife's name is also Shannon, and she took my last name when we got married, so we have the same name. But she spells it the way it's supposed to be spelled, and my way is spelled the way that my mom made up. And that's my wife, who's a teacher and knows how language works, says, well, your mom just didn't know how phonetics. Just didn't understand.
It was so much fun living with Shannon and Shannon and the confusion that ensued, and
cell phones. The advent of cell phones saved us a lot of headaches. Before then, there was a lot of confusion.
Yeah. Anyways, so to this day, I still can't call you guys the Rosses. I just call you the Shannons, like we were talking about. I just can't. Anyways, so we're talking about leadership, and I don't know if everyone here really appreciates the role that the Lilly Endowment has, or the impact it has on the religious landscape in the U.S. Like, there's a lot of grant money that goes from the Lilly Endowment out to the world, and a lot, and so Shannon has access to speakers, leaders across the country. Like, sometimes he'll name drop, and he's not name dropping because he's a very humble guy, but he'll just be talking about, oh, I had this conversation with so-and-so. I'm like, oh, I know who they are. Their book is on my shelf. Or I've heard them speak before, and you just had a conversation with them. Like, it's kind of crazy to me. So we were, a couple of years ago, we were part of this program with the Center for Congregations that the young adult initiative, like trying to build ministry in churches for young adults. And this is all done through the Center of Congregations, but Lilly Endowment's funding it all. And so we're at this big hotel downtown. There's about 150 pastors and church staff present, and we're all there. And then Shannon comes in at one point just to kind of check on it. And he comes and he sees me at the table, sits down. We start talking about kids and about life. You know, we're just having conversation. And I was so aware in that moment that everyone else in the room was looking at you. That, not looking at me, like looking at, because Shannon Ross just walked in the room, you know, and like everyone was like looking at him, like talking to me and wondering, what are we talking about? We're just talking about kids and family. I think a mission trip that was right before Noah and you went to Haiti for the first time.
Yeah, that's right.
So here's my question. Last week we talked about attention and eyes and the ability of leader to hold the eyes. So what is it like for you when everyone's gaze is at you, like, you know, locked on you? How do you manage that as a leader?
Well, when you suggested we talk about this, I was a little hesitant. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought about how anyone in a position of leadership, and this has certainly been the case for every role that I've had the opportunity to serve in the last 20 years, but everyone who is in some role of leadership experiences, let's just call it the gaze, right? Like someone either is working with you or for you, or that you're serving, or that you're like the gaze. And sure, so in that moment I walked into the room, and that particular room, I felt the gaze. But we're right now, right? Like there's the wonderful people here. There's also that camera, right? I mean,
the gaze is going out.
Yeah, it goes. But this can happen in lots of ways. It can happen if you're leading a meeting. It can happen when you're trying to deal with a delicate situation, and you're talking about the burden, right, of leadership. It can happen. You can feel the gaze when you're trying to manage social media, or try to figure out, well, when am I in my leadership role on social media? When am I just being myself? It can happen lots of different ways, right? So maybe you can think of a moment when you felt the gaze in one way or another for some reason or another. And I don't know about you, but a lot of the time I just can go through my work and leadership and it it's fine. But there are other moments when that gaze can make you self-conscious, by which I simply mean just deeply aware of yourself, right? And maybe that self-consciousness takes different forms. It manifests differently. Maybe you get nervous because of a situation, or maybe you're concerned. Maybe you become really focused in a way. But in whatever way it manifests, you're sort of deeply aware of yourself. But as I think you and Ruth Haley Barnes were pointing out, like, what we need in leaders are not people who are self-conscious, right? But servant leaders who are focused on the people that they want to serve, that they're trying to support. So I was thinking about how this happens, and there are these moments. I had one this week, right, where I feel that self-consciousness. And it's an invitation, I think, for us to become aware of our souls in a moment. Like when we do leadership, I think there's lots of leadership resources and they're all fine as far as they go, but they tend to emphasize our minds and our bodies, right? Like we lead with our minds and our bodies. But you were saying, what does it mean to lead out of your soul? A soulful leadership, right? And what's happening in my soul when I feel that self-consciousness, whether it's from the gaze or from some other reason? And what do you do? And so I think leadership is this opportunity to recognize that we have souls, and that the best leadership comes from a settled soul. That there's a lot of, like you were saying, a lot of things about leading that disrupt our soul because they make us self-conscious or because it pulls us in multiple directions. But so when I think about the gaze, I think about, well, what a practice that I sometimes do of just saying, God, let me serve. Lord, let me serve. Just like an arrow prayer, like something really, really simple. And it turns that energy, that sort of self-conscious energy, whether it's nervousness or, it turns me back to the people that God has called me to serve. And it's very simple, but it can be very effective if you do it very simply.
So one of the things you and I have talked about is like the afflictions, of the soul. That and this is something that you know so much more than I do about, because it's kind of based out of spiritual formation process you've been going through for a handful of years. But that we all confront different afflictions. And a few weeks ago we were talking, and you talked about the affliction of vainglory. And I thought, that's not a word that we often use, but I found myself thinking, especially with leadership, it kind of makes us confront vainglory. So say a little bit about what vainglory is and the dangers and temptations of it. So vainglory is there are two afflictions. There are 8 afflictions. There are 2 afflictions of the soul, and vainglory is one of them. And the other is
pride.
Pride.
And so when we think of pride, that's relatively straightforward. We know what that is. Pride is a self-orientation, right? Sort of living your life with yourself in the middle of it all the time. Vainglory is different than, it's like pride, but it's different than pride because it's doing the right thing for the wrong reason, right? So it's maybe serving, for example, in ways that are really needed, doing things that help others, guiding but doing it in a way that builds up yourself, that really is sort of like
vanity.
Yeah, it's kind of a vanity. And I think that as leaders, it's a particularly prevalent.
Especially today's world, when you think about social media and it's just so easy, like what people put out there, and they're hyper conscious of what they put out there, right? But when people are putting stuff out there, like it's vainglory, like it's kind of like wanting to be seen in the right way by all the right people.
And social media Jamal and I were talking about this a while back, like how important it is for organizations now, right? Like you really need, it's an amazing tool when it's used right. But I'm not on social media precisely for some of the reasons you just named. But it's not an option for all leaders to not be on it. But I think I had to really work through some affliction of vainglory in my life because I was driven, and I think a lot of leaders are very driven. You kind of have to be in some ways to survive, but working through it, vainglory disrupts your soul. But working through it to get to a settled soul, and a settled soul, you can hold space. You can create space for others, and you can lead generously. And that's the kind of leadership I think we see in Jesus.
So we're going off the script here a little bit, but like in your own life, what has helped you most to settle your soul?
Well, prayer. So a regular practice of prayer. And one of the things that I've learned is that there are different practices. I've sometimes said, it's sort of like how Harry Potter gets his wand, right? Like you don't choose it, but there's one for you, and you kind of have to discover it. The Holy Spirit has to give it to you. But when you have a regular prayer practice, one that works for you, it has to work. And you do it all the time. You do it regularly. You learn in that practice what it feels like to have your soul settled. And then you know what it's like when it's not. And then to be able to go back to prayer and say, Lord, here's this affliction. Here's this unsettled soul of mine. Can we talk about it?
Yeah. So it's really kind of like I'm going back to leadership for a second, but I think, when a lot of times I will experience some challenge in leadership, right? An email from someone or some thorny thing, like just when you think the coast is clear, then you get blindsided by something, like it just happens, right, in leadership. But then what it does is that it hits some affliction inside, like some fear that I have about, or some need to please everyone, or some
anger,
you just get unsettled.
Dejection.
And when you lead out of an unsettled place, a lot of times you just create more chaos, or at least I can speak. When I lead out of an unsettled place, good things don't happen. And prayer is a gift. That's where it drives us back into our relationship with God, because I find when I pray, Kim and I were talking about this with silence, like what is the experience of silence like for me? It's two things. Number one, I become a more thoughtful person when I pray, because I go from self-oriented to others-oriented. I just get more thoughtful. But secondly, I get clarity around, okay, here's all the things I could do, and a lot of them are impulsive and ugly and probably wouldn't solve the problem at all, or just feed some vainglory or some other, there's a whole, but then I get clarity around, okay, here's what's needed, and here's all the stuff that's not needed, and that's a gift.
And the ancient spiritual masters talked about discernment, right? So the prayer leads to a process of discernment, and so we're talking about leading soulfully, leading out of the soul. There's a difference between thinking things through and leading from a deeper place where you can discern. Okay, this is me, this is God. God's showing this is a way forward. And that can take time, but it definitely takes a settled soul.
And I would add, just as we kind of move to wrap this up, that this is not just if you're in charge of an organization or something.
Oh, no.
I think parenting.
That's what I was going to say.
as a leader, yeah.
You're right.
You talk about unsettled,
Yeah, and I think, I think parenting comes with more gravity than leading in, say, an organization. Like my job is my job, and it's fine, and there's a lot of weight with it. But parenting, when you feel the gaze of your child watching you and you know you failed. That's a pretty powerful moment. But yeah, to your point, to be able to bring that to God.
Yeah. One other thing that I think has been helpful, I think prayer is huge, but I think conversation in partnership with others is gigantic. Like Moses cries out, like, why have you given me this burden? Like like in Numbers 11. Well, the very next chapter, what God does is he brings elders, like a whole group of elders and judges to support him and be with him. Like he learns to, lean and share that burden of leadership with others. And so I would just say that I'm thankful for you, Shannon, thankful for Kim, thankful for our staff and our pastors and our leaders, because it's a gift to me to be able to share that burden of leadership with you.
Ditto.
Yeah.
We've been doing it now for a while.
Yeah. so if you're in a place where you feel like you have this great burden of leadership and you're not sure what to do, maybe just consider that's the exact place where God wants you to be. And it's not that he wants you to stay, like he didn't want Moses to stay in a place where he was burned out and where he was, but he wants you to be in that place so that you learn to lean on him and learn to lean on others, learn to share that burden and to feel yourself lifted, because I think that's how we experience grace.
Amen.
Amen.